Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture for History 1306, or U.S. History after 1877. The topic for this week is picking up right where we left off. We're going to be building into the Great Depression era. Basically, it's going to start in 1929 and continue on into the 1930s. And during this time period, we're going to see a very, very dramatic shift in American politics and really the cementing of modern day voting blocks amongst different political parties that we see today. And so I'm sort of alluding to it and beating around the bush, but really what we're going to see is the formalization of the voting bloc for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to shift away and start becoming more and more familiar to us as modern day people. And it's during the 1930s and during the Great Depression, underneath the New Deal plan, that the Democrats are going to start to form up the modern day voting bloc with which we are familiar. So we're going to take a look at that. And then we're also going to segue that into a discussion of what's going on in Europe during the interwar period. These things are very, very much interrelated. The Great Depression is a global phenomenon. It starts in the United States, but it's not specific to the United States. And we're going to go back and take a look at some of the economic wrangling that was done after World War I and see how that is going to badly devastate the global economic community. And so in that context, we're also going to begin to look at the rise of Nazism and of Hitler in Germany, because as you all are probably aware, that's what's going to lead us into our conversations for next week, which pick up with World War II. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into it. We need to take a look at the background of how this global depression really plays out. And to do that, we have to look back to what we talked about in our last lecture, and that is the establishment of the Dawes Act, and then after that in 1929, the establishment of the Young Plan. Now, what the Dawes Act did, if you remember thinking back to our last lecture, the Dawes Act set up a system in which American dollars went over to Germany. That way, Germany could pay back France and Britain for the reparations from World War I. If you remember, they owed about $33 billion to other nations in Europe, with the bulk of that money being directed to France and England. So we paid Germany so that they could make those payments to France and England, and then France and England would pay the United States back for loans that they received during World War I. So in a lot of ways, what was set up under the Dawes Act is American money basically propping up all of Europe. And it's tying Europe's banking system to the United States, into our economy. And then a few years later, the United States rolls out the Young Plan. This is going to reduce Germany's debt payments by about 20%. And it was really done in a way to sort of ease political tensions, mostly between France and Germany. Even with the United States giving money to Germany, they still weren't making those reparations payments to France and to England. And so the Young Plan was set up to say, all right, you have asked too much of the Germans, that you've put too big of a debt on their head. We need to reduce this by about 20%. But again, this just further entrenches Europe's banking system. It's connected now to the United States. It's connected to the American economy. So anytime you have a disruption in the American banking system or the American economy, it will lead to a very large domino effect. And it starts to topple all the financial institutions across the ocean in Europe. Now, that would be one thing. If it stopped there, we would have seen a depression hit the United States, and then we would have seen a depression hit Europe. But we have to also think about what's going on globally at this time. Europe owns a majority of the rest of the world. Europe has established direct political control over all of Africa, over most of the territories of Asia. And so what happens is America is going to go broke first, and then the domino effect hits Europe, and then Europe goes broke. And now their economies in the colonies are going to go broke as well. And so you're starting to see how a stock market crash in New York City can lead to this massive downturn in the global economy that we call the Great Depression. So it's hitting the colonies, it's hitting Europe, it's hitting the United States, but there's still other people out there. How did they deal with the Great Depression? Well, the problem for everybody else is that you're either doing business with America, the colonies, or Europe. And if they don't have money anymore, you have nobody to do business with. And so there's so few truly independent nations that are going to stay out of the first wave of collapse in the global depression. The independent nations are not even going to be able to stay afloat because nobody around the world has any money to do business. And that's going to cripple their economies as well. And so with this system being in place, you can kind of look back at the 1929 stock market crash, and it's always easy for us in the living in the future now compared to them to look back and say, how did you not see this? How did you not see that this was going to be a problem? But that's exactly what it was. Is in that time period, they weren't looking at the future. They were trying to deal with the immediate present. And this is what ended up happening, is that it tied everybody together on a global scale economically, so that when an economic event happens in New York and collapses the American banking and financial institutions, that's going to trickle down to the rest of the world. So the stock market crash, or of 1929, and a day that it happens on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, that's what they call Black Tuesday. What happens here is that panicked stock exchange traders out of the blue sell almost 16 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange. The Dow Jones Industrial Average falls by 11 to 12%. And this market collapse that happens on Black Tuesday, if you're looking for the significance of it, this is always going to be pointed out as the primary factor behind the Great Depression. There's something going on in American stock markets that help to drive this crash, that facilitate this beginning of a global depression. The first thing is that the prices of shares in the stock market are overly inflated. Simply put, the stock market had been rising for so long that American investors were cocky. They were overeager. They were too confident, they had gotten so used to a stock market that was always rising, they didn't really stop to think about what happens when it dips. So they're paying a lot of money for companies that are basically just a name on paper. People are buying stocks in those companies, but they don't even know what they're actually producing or what that company represents. That's one of the problems. Number two is that people are engaging in this practice, and it sort of goes hand in hand with number one. But they're engaging in this practice called buying on the margin. Now, what that means is that on Monday, I'll walk into a bank and I'll say, give me a loan for $30,000. And they're going to give me a loan. My plan is to invest that $30,000 in the stock market, pull it out maybe 6 months to a year later, pay my loan back to the bank, and take the profit for myself. And this is a very common practice. Now, here is, again, this kind of all three of these factors tie together. Here's where this becomes a major problem. If I'm out there buying on the margin, first and foremost, the presumption is the stock market's going to keep going up, right? So if I take $30,000 out on Monday, 6 months from Monday, I'm thinking it's going to be higher. But what happens when it goes down? Now I can't pay my loan back to the bank. So now I've defaulted on the loan and the bank doesn't get their money back. And now here's where number three comes in. Where did that money that I got from the bank come from? Is it the bank's money? Is it government money? Is it federal money? No, this is your money. This is my money. This is the money that we put into our savings accounts. This is the money that we invest in interest, sort of high interest yields. This is what people are investing in CDs and stocks. Basically, when you put your money in a bank back in the 1920s, the bank's going to do whatever they want with it. They're going to take all your money and they're going to give it to me to invest in the stock market. And so here, this explains why there are millions of Americans who lose their shirt. They cannot survive this Great Depression. But only 10% of Americans are actively investing in the stock market. And this is how it happens. That 10% of Americans who are working in the stock market were using everybody's money. And so people started running on the banks after the stock market crash, trying to get their money out. And this just creates this, again, sort of an economic domino effect. Everybody pulls their money out. Nobody's investing in the stock market. All of our financial institutions die almost instantaneously. They just collapse. And so this is what Black Tuesday and the stock market crash bring on. And you can see that this kind of major economic shift or downturn, really a very negative event to the American economy, this has that trickle effect going all the way over to Europe and then to their economies and then to any other independent trading partners around the world. So, obviously, as we're seeing in modern times, this has become this major issue in 1929, and politicians need to react to it. They need to try to respond to the stock market crash. And Herbert Hoover is going to be the president who takes over this problem. And if you think about it, Hoover, for a very long time, was seen as one of the worst presidents in American history. But really, if you look back at it and you put it in retrospect, you can see that he actually just is very unfortunate. He comes into the White House and into the Oval Office at a time when things are looking really bad for the United States. Now, Hoover is a classic Republican of the era. And what that means, to be a Republican back in the 1920s, means that you believe in laissez-faire, free market capitalism. And this is what Hoover believes too. He's the classic rags to riches story. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He worked hard for everything that he got. And he believes that no matter what, Americans can get over any problem if they simply pull themselves up by the bootstraps and take care of themselves. And so really that's the response that Hoover's going to have. And as you can imagine, when people are suffering, when they are dying of starvation, when they can't feed their kids, they can't find work, there's no opportunity, having the American government look at you and go, that's tough, you better work harder, that's not a very satisfactory answer to the people. They're not going to want to hear that. And so this is how the Republicans are operating at this time. They look at this situation, and they basically say, we're laissez-faire Republicans. We can't touch the economic sector. That goes against every single thing we believe in. We believe in a free market economy. We have to let the economy fix itself. If the government gets in and starts regulating it, we've now thrown out all of our economic beliefs as Republicans. And so what Hoover does is he takes a different approach. He's a realist too. He sees this and he goes, hey, laissez-faire or no laissez-faire, we got to do something. This is looking really bad. And so he actually reaches out to business leaders and he says, look, I know you're struggling. I know you're losing money, but please don't start massive layoffs of workers. That's only going to make our situation worse. And so this is going to work for a while. And the business leaders are going to do what they can. They're going to basically take the hit and say, we'll try to keep people employed, but that's only going to last so long. When you're the guy who owns the business and you're watching money just drain out of your company's account every month, paying for workers who are producing things that are not selling because nobody has any money to buy them, you can only sustain this for so long. So the business leaders do try to work with the government without the government needing to pass regulation. And of course, that's something that the Republicans are going to be very resistant to because that's just not part of their political philosophy. So Hoover tries to protect the agricultural sector by asking Congress to raise tariffs on any imported farm goods that are coming from outside the United States. The problem with this is that Europe responds in kind. Europe says, if you're going to make it more expensive to bring our products into your economy, we're going to do the same thing. And what that does is it basically stops trade entirely on a global scale. Europe and the United States are no longer doing business with each other. And so it just worsens this already really bad economic situation. Now, he also appeals to state governments, and this is one of the ways he gets around his own label of Republican. He says, look, I need you all to increase job production. You need to start undertaking infrastructure projects. Start building roads, start building railroads, start building canals, dams, all these things that we need built in the United States because that's a good way to put people on the government payroll, but they're still getting something done for society. This isn't a free ride. We're not just writing them a check to sit there and be poor. We're going to put them to work, and that is part of the government philosophy at the time. And so it's really, what's interesting is some of our most important infrastructure projects in the United States were built during the Great Depression because it was a way to try to get people work again. It was a way for the government to infuse money back into the economy without just writing checks to people. And for anybody who is familiar with economics, you know that the government just simply writing blank checks to the public and paying for the public is a completely unsustainable way for a government to run. So the Boulder Dam was constructed during this time period. It's a 1,000-foot high, 2.5 mile wide dam that blocks up the Colorado River and uses it for hydroelectric power. It was built between 1931 and 1936, and at the time, it is the largest concrete structure ever built, and it utilizes countless laborers and engineers to design it and then to actually build it. So they have since renamed this particular landmark after the president who ordered its construction, Herbert Hoover. This is now what we call the Hoover Dam. And what you see here is that people are migrating all over the United States looking for work. Las Vegas, actually, because the construction of the Hoover Dam in Nevada, Las Vegas sees this massive influx in population. It jumps from a population of about 5,000 to 20,000 as soon as the dam project was announced. 15,000 people poured into the city looking for work. It shows you how desperate they are at the time. And so most of the people who are coming into this desert city were unemployed migrants moving around the country looking for work. But those kinds of construction projects help to get people, it helped the government employ laid off citizens at this point in time. So finally, the Republicans are going to ultimately, they're going to have to break, and they're going to have to intervene federally in the private sector, in the economy. So despite him being a noted progressive, Hoover tries his best to keep the federal government out of the affairs of the private sector, but it's just not going to work. By 1932, U.S. Steel, which is one of the largest employers in the United States at the time, followed by a bunch of other corporations, followed by the automotive industry in Detroit, followed by the oil industry being run out of a collective and trustees in New York. All these industries just start collapsing, and they cut wages and they start laying off workers in large numbers. So the business owners tried their best to keep people on the payroll, but it just was completely unsustainable, and they start cutting people loose. Hoover is going to respond by directly investing federal money into private businesses. This is where we get this is the origin of that concept in American political economies of this company is too big to fail. We cannot let U.S. Steel fall off the face of the earth. They employ too many people. And so finally, even Hoover and the Republicans say, enough's enough. We love laissez-faire, free market economies, but we need to do something. This is a totally different can of worms that's been opened up here with the Great Depression. And so this is a drastic break from the previous policies. Generally, what the federal government would do is lower spending and interest rates, but it would always allow the private investors to address and rectify problems in the economy themselves. This is the first time that the government just says, that's it, we've got to give money to a private industry. It's something that needs to be done. And so this is a concept that's going to carry through, and we saw it happen not too long ago with the collapse of the automotive industry. Under the Obama administration, they determined that Detroit's automotive industry was too big to fail, despite its inefficiency and inability to compete on a global market. And so they infused government money into that industry. This is the first time we see that happening during the Great Depression in 1932. So there's some other interesting social things that are going on during this time period. And it kind of shows us how Americans are reacting to this political response. American unemployment reaches about 20% by the early 1930s. The country is destitute and desperate. We are completely poor and we're out of ideas. And a lot of Americans tend to put this squarely on Hoover. And this doesn't go real well for him because he's actively running for re-election in 1932. But all over the nation, but particularly in the crowded cities, places like Portland, Oregon, Houston, Texas, Detroit, Michigan, New York City, you start to see these little shanty towns popping up. Basically, people building ramshackle structures and moving into them. And they're happening just outside the city. But what ends up happening is they call these things Hoovervilles, and that's a direct knock at the president. So what we tend to see here is that the people are going, this is the government's fault. This is the government's problem, and we're the ones who are needing to deal with the fallout of it. And they blame this directly on Hoover. The other people would generally walk by one another and they salute one another, give each other a wave with what they called the Hoover flag. I'm actually going to stand for this. And you can see I'm not wearing shorts or anything. But what they would do is they'd walk by each other and they'd go like this, and they'd pull their pocket out to show that my pocket's empty too. They called that waving with the Hoover flag. So you can see that with this kind of frustration in America becoming this desperate, it really gets taken out on Hoover himself. This is all going to culminate in an event known as the Bonus March in the summer of 1932. Here we see 40,000 American veterans and their families, veterans of World War I, marching on Washington, D.C. They're desperate, they need money, and they're owed money by the federal government, and they're demanding an early payment from Congress. They were promised a bonus, that's why they call it the Bonus March, and Congress was supposed to award this to them, but Congress didn't have the money. And so ultimately, this is something where they get frustrated, they're angry, and they go march on Washington, D.C. But the demonstration ends in violence because the government actually sends out federal soldiers to disperse the crowds with tanks, rifles, and bayonets. So when American citizens are most desperate and they're petitioning the government for change, the federal government responds by attacking them. And this is something that Hoover's not going to survive this. There's no way he's going to win the next election. Clearly, he has made too many missteps in the handling of the Depression in its early years. And so ultimately, he's going to be the one who kind of falls on the sword. He's the one who takes the majority of the blame for how this all went in the early years of the Great Depression. What's happening is that it's a pretty easy path for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate in the 1932 election, to be swept into the White House. So FDR, as he's widely known, is a Democrat, and he's acutely aware and says to the people, look, we have a political democracy, but we have an economic plutocracy. What that means is a fancy way of saying that we're supposed to be a nation for and by the people, where the people's voices are heard. But in terms of money, most of our resources and our wealth and our economic strength is in the hands of very, very few people. And so he says these things don't work side by side. We need to create more equity. We need to change the way that the American economy and American capitalism works. And so he also knows that this is going to require federal intervention. This is not something like, as Hoover tried to do, where the government can stay out of it and not address the problem and allow it to correct itself. Roosevelt knows that's not going to happen. And so when FDR takes office, he starts devising what's known as his New Deal plan. The New Deal was a series of legislative actions carried out between 1933 and 1938, and they were generally designed to promote economic recovery, obviously being the biggest issue in the middle of the Great Depression, but they go a step further, and their goal is to, in a lot of ways, reform American capitalism generally. And what they're proposing is that the federal government should be able to regulate, become involved in, sort of invest in, and have some sort of exchange with the private sector, with the private economy. And so this is what the New Deal is all about. It is government regulation on the private economy. This is the polar opposite of what Republicans of the time period believe in, laissez-faire free market economies. And so this is a rather drastic and bold plan of action. So, as you're going through the PowerPoint slide, you can see there's a lot of different acts that are being rolled out as part of the New Deal. There's a few of them that I wanted to highlight because they do some interesting things, and they work in certain ways that still have a rather large impact on us here today. So we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was kind of an interesting act pushed by Roosevelt and the Democrats under the New Deal plan. What the CCC, as it's widely known, is all about is employing young men in reforestation efforts. A lot of the old-growth timber across the United States have been cut down to build this sort of framework for houses, skyscrapers, all that kind of stuff, although the skyscrapers are generally built more with steel as their support than wood. They used a lot of America's timber resources. And so what the CCC does is it says, let's put these young guys back to work, give them a job, and they can go out and reforest. They can go take care of the more rural parts of America. There's a strategy here to this. There's a tactic that underlies this. They're not doing this just because they so badly want to regain these trees, or they so badly need to employ anybody to go and undertake this act. This is specific and targeted. When you've got a bunch of young guys sitting around without work, clustering together in an urban center, that generally doesn't play out real well. That's going to end in a riot. That's going to end in wide-scale crime. That's going to end in a lot of problems. And so what they're really trying to do is get the young guys who are a little bit more reactive than the older generations tend to be, get them out and away from the cities where they can do damage. Stick them out in the middle of nowhere and tell them to replant the trees. So that's what the Civilian Conservation Corps was all about. You have the Public Works Administration was kind of going hand in hand with those ideas that Hoover rolled out, like investing in infrastructure. The PWA is all about federal construction projects designed to employ the poorest Americans. And really what's interesting about the PWA is a lot of people went back to work. This was designed to help the factory worker. This is designed to help somebody who doesn't necessarily work in what they call a skilled profession per se. It's not to say that it doesn't take any level of personal skill, but to say that you don't need any sort of mastery of a trade. And so the PWA is going to be looking to get those types of Americans who are working in factories, standing there pulling a lever, doing that kind of thing, get them back to work. And so that's what the PWA was all about. Then we have the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act is passed in 1933 alongside a slew of other legislation. But this separates investor from commercial banking sectors. This goes back and addresses that problem I was talking about that contributed to the global depression. What it says is you can't take private investors' money. Joe Davy can't come into the bank and say, I want my $30,000 loan, and they pull that money from all of your bank accounts to give to me to invest in commercial banking. So what it does is separates those two sectors apart. And so the commercial banking interests can no longer have access to private investor money. So that we can't have this situation where 10% of the American public's actions end up creating a massive global depression. So there's also the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was where jobs were created to start to provide a higher quality of life to certain rural areas of America. The Tennessee Valley at this point in time is one of the most impoverished and sort of backwater places in the United States. They have major problems with malarial mosquitoes. The Tennessee Valley has rivers and tributaries running everywhere through it. So there's a lot of water and there's a lot of mosquitoes. So they put forth an effort to eradicate the malarial mosquitoes. They're trying to reclaim eroded soil that had been washed away by the changing sort of currents of the river as they had changed over the years. But they also, in order to provide electricity, they tried to create hydroelectric dams, just like they had done with the Hoover Dam. In doing this, they actually flooded the federal government under FDR knowingly flooded 15,000 people in the Tennessee Valley out of their homes. They destroyed their homes and left them with nowhere to live. Anybody who has ever seen the movie, and I'm probably dating myself here, it's got Burt Reynolds in it, and what was that one called? Deliverance, They're sailing down through the Tennessee River Valley, and it's set during this time period where the Tennessee Valley is become so backwater and so strange that you have these, people living up there who are completely off the grid. And they end up, hunting people and whatnot. I don't want to get into the movie plot, but my point is, what this does is that it creates a situation in which the Tennessee Valley, because all these people were flooded out of their homes, it creates an even deeper mistrust of the people in that area for the federal government. They really, really don't trust the federal government because the government knowingly flooded their homes but didn't tell them that's what they were going to do. And so they ultimately, that area of the nation, it tends to remain very rural, very backwater, very unconnected to the rest of the United States because they simply don't want to integrate into the wider population because of this mistrust. But that was a really interesting episode of American history where they were trying to bring the quality of life up in this area, but they ended up flooding a lot of people out of their homes in order to do so. In 1935, one of the most lasting aspects of the New Deal is passed. That is the Social Security Act. This creates the government run pensions into which most of us pay today. So, it provides unemployment insurance to people who are out of a job. It provides social welfare to, and this really reflects the attitudes of the time. The more progressive and liberal end of political spectrums, they put together this act and they said, we'll provide social welfare to married women, no unmarried women allowed, with children and the disabled. And so you can see that what they're trying to do here is set up this sort of safety net with the Social Security Act. Now, this is something that is hotly contested at the time. Today, we take it as sort of an inevitability. You start working, you've got to pay into Social Security. Unfortunately, as far back as when I was your age and in college, they've been telling us that by the time we all get to retirement, Social Security will dried up, and so we'll be paying for other people's retirement, but we're not going to actually get anything out of it ourselves. So if that's still the case and they don't revamp Social Security, you all have that to look forward to. But the Social Security Act is going to set this up in which they're saying, and this is a really good time to sort of stop and look at the disagreement over New Deal policies and why certain people would say, I don't really support that. I don't want anything to do with that. This goes against a lot of what the American public tends to believe in up until this point in history. With the Social Security Act, basically what the government is saying is you don't get to decide what to do with your money. We're going to tell you what to do with your money. If you don't want to invest in your own retirement, then we're going to force you to invest in your own retirement. And there's a lot of people out there who say basically, I don't really want to invest in that. A lot of people think I'm probably not going to make it that deep into retirement, especially back then, because you had people retiring at the age of 55 to 60 years old, and the life expectancy wasn't much beyond 67. And so they weren't out of work for an exceptionally long time before they died. But what we're tending to see here is that this is where a lot of the blowback comes in. And the Republicans say, look, why should the government tell you what to do with your money? What if you needed the money that they're forcing you to put into retirement? What if you need that right now as upstart capital to start a business? And then later on down the line, you'd take even more money and put it into your retirement, but they just stopped you from opening your own business because they said, no. You got to take that money and put it into your retirement. And so what we're seeing here is that there is a lot of pushback towards this because Americans traditionally don't like to be told what to do by the government, particularly with our money. It comes down to this idea that for the longest time, Americans have been, if you want to invest in retirement, invest in retirement. If you don't, die poor. That's your choice. That's your call. And so there's a lot of Americans, especially Republicans, that push back. And the Social Security Act is one of those things where they say, why should the Democratic Party and the federal government tell you what to do with your money? Are you too stupid to know that you need to invest in a government in a retirement? Are you so inept that you need the government to run your retirement plan for you? And so that's the kind of thing that ultimately is going to really have a deep, lasting impact on America when it comes to the New Deal. I also want you to take a look at the Wagner Act, which provides federal protection for unions and labor organizations. This is why we have unions. They are protected. They're no longer going to have this sort of up and down like we saw at the end of the 19th century. And then the Fair Labor Standards Act is going to set a national minimum wage and maximum work hours per week. And so, again, this is seen as interfering in private industry, interfering in the private enterprise. And there's going to be a lot of political response to this. Republicans of the 1930s deeply mistrust FDR's New Deal. They argue, number one, that he's acting autocratically, that basically Congress is raising all these red flags going, wait a minute, you're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of dollars that you're spending. Who's paying for this? This is federal government money. And I should hope that, everyone's familiar with this concept of there's no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody pays for this. And when you think about it, if the government's going to be paying for it, where do they get their money? From us. We have to pay for this in tax dollars. And the Republicans are saying basically the Congress, even your own party, Democrats in Congress are saying, wait a minute, we need to think about this before we pass it. And FDR is going, move now. And he's basically doing this by bullying them. He's going to come out and sort of say, and there was a lot of similar rhetoric around the Iraq war after 9/11. You're either with the war or you're not patriotic. And what FDR does is you're either for rebuilding America and getting us out of the Depression or you hate America. That's who you are. And so he's kind of bullying a lot of Congress into passing this legislation. And he's not really considering the long-term impact of these policies economically. Now, they're also arguing that the New Deal is going to greatly expand the role of government in Americans' private and professional lives, to the point that this expansion is in fact, unconstitutional. That's the way that they're challenging a lot of the New Deal policies, is they're saying, it says right in the Constitution that this is none of the business of the federal government. But he's ignoring the Constitution and acting autocratically and forcing these policies down everyone's throat. Finally, there's a very practical disagreement with the New Deal policies, and that is the fact that it costs tons and tons and tons of money. When you look at this and you convert it up to modern day currency, all of these policies cost about $9 billion. This is not a small price tag under any stretch of the imagination. And so they're saying, look, you can't just write checks. The money's got to come from somewhere. And this is something that with the other ones, FDR always had a response. He could say, look, the government needs to expand its roles into private citizens' lives. That's what progressivism is all about. That's what we're trying to do, is set up these progressive policies that help the people who are struggling. It's the job of the government to help people who are struggling. So he's got a pretty easy argument there. He's saying, look, if Congress were left to debate everything all day long, we'd be in the Depression 15 years from now. They'll never get this done. So I am going to act like an autocrat and pass this through. The final point, FDR really doesn't have a response to it. And if you're looking in retrospect, he actually gets kind of lucky. Most economic historians tend to agree that FDR was able to do what he did without any immediate repercussions economically, because World War II is actually what pulls us out of the Depression economically. World War II is what's going to ultimately bring production back up in the United States. All of these policies are all fine and good, but they don't actually produce more private sector jobs. That's going to happen with World War II. When the automotive companies ramp into full gear and stop producing cars, they start building planes and tanks. All of the sort of industrial capability of America is turned towards war. That's what pulls us out of the Great Depression. That's what puts people back to work and puts money in their pockets. And so really what FDR did was kind of just kick the economic can down the road, and then he gets lucky with the outbreak of World War II, and that we don't see any glaring economic problems here. So that's something that he's going to be able to sort of navigate. But FDR and the push for these New Deal policies, this changes American politics into what we generally tend to recognize today. The Democratic Party forms and coalesces around the New Deal. That's what gives the modern Democratic Party its identity as being the party of the poor, the party of minorities, the party of trade unions. That's the party that fights for the working class. This is where that identity is formed during the Great Depression and under the New Deal policies. So Democrats from FDR onwards would be dedicated to the federal funding of social welfare projects, increasing private taxes to the taxpayers to raise federal spending, and advocating for government intervention into the private industries. These are all hallmarks of liberalism and democratic thought processes from this point forward. They say when a big industry is about to collapse, we have a responsibility to go in and prop them up. They say when people are struggling and can't find work, it's the job of the federal government to step in and provide them with a safety net. So The opposite is true for the Republicans because their opposition, they're sort of forming their own identity out of opposition to the New Deal policies and plans. From this point forward, what the sort of rallying cry for Republicans becomes lower taxes, cutting the federal budget, steering money away from social welfare projects and towards government spending in the military, in defense, in bigger and better infrastructure. So really what we're seeing here is that the Republicans are still going to keep up that idea of we advocate for the free markets. The more the government gets involved in something, the more it tends to get screwed up. That's the way that Republicans view things from this point forward. And so what we're seeing is we're starting to see that formalization. And the Republicans start to become viewed as the party of the wealthy because a lot of times when they say, look, people get caught up in the restructuring. People lose their jobs. People starve to death. People live in poverty when you allow the free market to correct itself because it doesn't happen overnight. There are casualties to capitalism. It's a reality. But those casualties are far less than when you have an overbloated government budget randomly spending money all over the place that you can't even track or find. And so the Democrats become increasingly associated with the poor, with minority groups, labor unions and organizations, and social justice initiatives. And by 1936, the supporters of the New Deal are being labeled as liberals. Those who are opposing New Deal legislation start to be called conservatives. And so basically, this is where we get our modern parties. Up until this point, the Republicans were still widely viewed as the party of African Americans because they were the party of Lincoln. They're going to be viewed as the party of responsible government spending. But really, it's ultimately this shift in the 1930s under the Great Depression that drives the voting blocks of both parties into these polar opposite ends. And the parties respond to that in kind. Political parties are living, breathing entities. If the voting bloc changes, they change their tune about what it is they stand for. And so you're going to see, obviously, adaptations to these political structures over the long haul. They're not exactly the same today as they were in the 1930s. But what you are starting to see here is that there is really sort of this formalization of the voting blocks that we're familiar with seeing today. So there's a lot of other things going on domestically and socially during the New Deal plan. It helps us to sort of take a look at different demographic groups in the United States and see how this Great Depression and the New Deal is impacting them. So the Indian Affairs Bureau is going to be in existence since the 1880s. They're a group that is dealing with Native American issues and what's going on. Well, obviously, Native Americans are living on reservations. They are not doing well to begin with economically. So when the Depression hits, it hits them particularly hard. So their ability to govern themselves or adapt to any of this has been severely limited since the Dawes Act of 1887. But under the New Deal policies, there's going to be a director of the Indian Affairs Bureau. He becomes the Indian Affairs Commissioner. His name is John Collier. He's generally seen as being more appreciative of Native American culture than previous bureau heads. But he is going to introduce the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. This is colloquially or popularly known as the Indian New Deal. What it does is it restores self-governance to the reservations. It gives Native American leaders a lot of the authority back to take control of their own situation. And so this would lead a lot of Native Americans to turn inwards towards their own roots and identity, leading to sort of a Native American revival, a revival in their traditional religious beliefs, a revival in their language customs, a revival in their dress and their habits. And so these are things that are going to strengthen sort of Native American identities within the communities on the reservations. But there's a dark underside to this that we do need to take a look at. When they give self-governance back to the Native Americans on the reservations, they do it in a way that kind of lets the American government off the hook. The American government is spending gobs of money to help the poorest of the poor, but when it gets to Native Americans, the Indian Reorganization Act in a lot of ways allows the federal government to say, hey, we gave you the decision-making process back. We restored your ability to govern yourselves. Don't come looking to us when you need economic help. And so what this does in a lot of ways is it puts Native Americans on the outside of the Democrats' push to get the poorest of the poor help. They realize the Democrats do look and they're politically looking at this and saying the Native Americans are not a huge voting bloc, not real concerned with helping them out. And so this is sort of the attitude in the 1930s. So while you could look at the Indian New Deal and say it restores a lot of the sort of cultural integrity of Native Americans, it does also sort of exonerate the United States government from doing a whole heck of a lot to help them. And so Native Americans will suffer really, really badly under the global depression, under the Great Depression in the United States. So another group that we're going to be taking a look at is people of Mexican descent. And so we generally refer to this time period as what they call Mexican repatriation, but I'm going to use a lot of quotes in this section, and I'm sorry, I hate air quotes as much as the next guy, but it's necessary here. Because when you talk about repatriation, that means that you're sending somebody who's actually from there back to that nation. And that's not really the case of what's going to happen here. In 1929, right when the stock market crashes, people in the American Southwest, areas like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, these areas down here, they are really looking at this situation and going, we need to give the advantage to native-born people. There's not a lot of work, right? It's a Great Depression. That alone should tell you there's not help wanted signs all over the place. But there's a lot of competition for labor. And in the American Southwest, people of Mexican descent or direct Mexican immigrants are competing with native-born people for these jobs. And so to eliminate that competition, the federal government banned further legal immigration from Mexico. But in addition to that, instead of just saying, all right, we'll end it there, no more immigrants are coming in from the southern border, we're stopping immigration from Mexico. What they say is they go a step further and they encourage Mexican immigrants that are already here to go back home. And so between 1929 and 1936, the numbers are real hazy because there's not a lot of great documents kept about this time period of American history. But historians estimate, who are specialists in this field, that think anywhere between 50,000 and 2 million people of Mexican descent will leave the U.S. and travel to Mexico. Now, here's why I put a lot of air quotes around things when I talk about this particular situation. We estimate that about 60% of those returning migrants are not returning migrants at all. They were born in the United States and thus by law, U.S. citizens. And so a lot of the people that are getting up and leaving are going back to a country that they don't have any innate or acute ties to. These are people that weren't born in Mexico. They were born in the United States. They've never lived in Mexico. They're just people of Mexican descent. And they're actually part of this repatriation process. Now, large farm owners are fighting against this tooth and nail because even as far back as the 1930s, you tend to hear that argument of, well, they're taking American jobs. Well, when I offer these jobs to American-born people, they don't take them. No American-born person is going to work hard labor in a orchard or a farm. And so the large farm owners are saying, look, we're going to have they are the backbone of our industry. They are the workers. And if we don't have them, we're going to have huge labor shortages. But the U.S. and Mexican government both equally sort of contribute to this goal. They offer free trips back to Mexico, and they're hoping to sort of reduce the number of migrants coming into the United States. They're kind of working hand in hand with one another. It's also in the midst of this sort of push to repatriate, as they call it, Mexican people back to Mexico or to Mexico for the first time, depending on who we're talking about. They passed something in 1937 known as the Stamp Act. This allows the federal government to target Mexican and African Americans for arrest unfairly. The Stamp Act is actually related to, and it's the first law in the books that targets marijuana. And so in the 1930s, there are generally three groups that are widely associated with the consumption and basically, let's just put it bluntly, there's three groups that are associated with smoking weed. And they're generally mountain folk, people in like the Tennessee Valley, because marijuana grows very well in high elevations. And they have a long tradition there of growing marijuana and smoking it like it was tobacco. And so that's one group. But Mexican migrants are another group that is widely associated with marijuana at this point in time in the 1930s, and then also African American jazz musicians. These are the three groups, and what the Stamp Act is all about is it allows federal government agents to target these groups. What it says is it doesn't say marijuana is illegal. It says you can't have it, sell it, possess it, smoke it, do anything with it unless you are given a government issued stamp. That stamp has never been issued to anyone. So this is a way for them to selectively target people. There's a panic amongst the white American community about young white women having interracial relationships with black jazz musicians. And so they know that they can use the Stamp Act to target those musicians because they are widely known to smoke marijuana. And so they would use that to selectively go after them. They would use it to selectively go after Mexican migrants who are coming in from Mexico to work in the American Southwest, or people of Mexican descent already living here. And so up until that point, nobody could ever stop you for having marijuana. It was just a plant like any other plant. You're allowed to grow it, use it, do whatever you want with it. But when they saw that there were certain groups that they wanted to target who were most associated or tended to have the product on them the most, they put this act into law, and they used it to target those groups. So African Americans are up until 1932, they're still a very critical voting bloc in the United States. And until 1932, the Republicans are firmly going to hold the loyalty of African Americans. You have to remember, in the context of this time period, the African American community looks at the Republicans and the Democrats and they say, in the midst of the Civil War, the Democrats were fighting to keep us in slavery. And the Republicans are the ones who basically got us out. And so they have always been loyal Republican voters to this point. But the Depression hits them worse. They're already, again, just like Native Americans, when you're already living in an economic disadvantage and then a Depression sweeps through, you're going to get it even worse than everybody else. I mean, you're already hurting economically. And so now African Americans are really hard hit. With the global depression and the Great Depression, and so they are desperate. And the New Deal policy is seen as helping them sort of get better access to jobs. It's putting them back to work. It's putting money back in their pockets. And so this firmly draws African Americans into the Democratic voting bloc. They're going to join what they call the New Deal Coalition. This is a group of voting blocs that come together to form the backbone of the Democratic Party at this time. It's a political partnership formed in the mid-1930s that brings together liberals who are in favor of high government taxation and spending, trade unionists, Catholics, and African Americans. And together they form the new voting bloc of the Democratic Party in the mid-1930s. So, as if things weren't bad enough with the Great Depression, we're going to have some severe environmental problems during this time period as well. And this is what's known as the Dust Bowl. These are basically periods of drought coupled with the failure to use environmentally responsible farming techniques that led to widespread dust clouds rolling all over the Plains states, in particular the southern Plains states during the 1930s. A lot of people called this time period the Dirty 30s because dust was blowing all over the place. So basically, this is how this happened. That area, as we saw with the Homestead Act, was targeted for settlement and generally targeted for agricultural settlement. The problem is you have a bunch of people moving out there planting farms and they don't understand environmentally sustainable farming techniques. So they are planting year after year. They're planting things like corn. They're planting wheat. They're planting crops that are not sustainable. You need to be moving your plot where you grow it season by season. You can't just keep planting corn over and over again on the land, or it sucks all the nutrients out of the land and depletes it, dries it up. But that's exactly what they do in the southern plains states. And so we have these high winds start blowing through the southern plains, and the topsoil is eroded. It's completely dead. It's dust. It is you can't plant in it. You can't use it for anything. And when the high winds come through, they create these massive dust clouds that roll through the plains states. They limit visibility. They make breathing really just intensely difficult. and they are going to destroy any existing crops or farmlands. So if you do have a nice field that hasn't been eroded yet, what happens after 3 feet of dust comes and gets dropped on top of it? It's going to die. And so these dust storms are so big. They call them black rollers, but they're so large that they sometimes go from the plain states, and dust is blowing into Washington D.C. and New York. And so we're talking about them basically blowing the entire eastern. There's dust being deposited over the whole eastern half of the United States. 2.5 million people are going to have to flee their lands in the plain states. Most of them head west. They start to go out towards California. There's a pervasive rumor during the Great Depression that California, for whatever reason, had somehow made it out scot-free. They weren't suffering under the same conditions as everyone else. That's just a rumor. But 35 million acres of farmland end up totally destroyed in the Dust Bowl. Another 125 million acres witness substantial loss of topsoil. It's going to be years before you can come back and plant there. So many of the migrants who move out west come from Oklahoma that pretty much they take to calling every migrant who shows up in California an Okie. But that's going to show you that just how widespread and pervasive this drought was. And so these are all problems that are plaguing the United States in the 1930s while they're having this depression. But really, the most important thing you should be taking away from that whole part of the lecture is it's what leads to the formation of the modern Democratic voting bloc. It's what coalesces the ideas of the Democratic Party into what we recognize them as today. Because up until the 1930s, the Democratic Party was not associated with the party of the poor. They're not looking to help the working class people. They take those progressive ideas that came away from the people like the first Roosevelt and Taft and these other sort of progressive presidents. And they're going to take all of those ideas and actually start putting them into action. And so that's what we start to see with the 1930s. Now, I am going to briefly turn my attention to what's happening in Europe because by next week we're going to be talking about World War II. So we need to see what's going on over there. So the interwar government in Germany is known as the Weimar Republic. And so we often, when we look at this in global history, it's often referred to as Weimar Germany. When the worldwide depression hits, it hits Germany hardest of all. Remember, as I said of African Americans and Native Americans, if you're already suffering when a depression hits, it ain't going to get better. It's going to get worse. And it's going to get even worse for you than it would be for the guy who's economically sound when it hits. Germans are already broke from World War I. They had to give up all of their overseas colonies. They've given them to Britain and France, so that limits the amount of money they can make on those kinds of endeavors. They're being forced to pay back $33 billion in war reparations. Now, in addition to this, Weimar Germany makes some missteps of its own. They print too much money, and that results in hyperinflation, which means that it's harder and harder and harder to buy the average consumer goods. And you start to see food riots happening all across Germany. In addition to that kind of chaos, Germans are also upset that after they missed their first reparations payment way back in 1923, French troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, which is Germany's major industrial center. And they occupy that territory. They say, if you're not going to pay us back our money, we're going to take your industrial center. And they have martial law in that area for years. And this leads to widespread civil unrest in that region as well. They don't like that the French have come in and occupied their land. Now, since their entire economic system, the backbone of it is making sure that America gives them money to start paying their loans back, when the stock market crash happens in New York, it's going to bring Germany to a complete economic standstill. After 1929, millions of Germans lost their jobs. The major national banks collapsed. And so it's all of these kinds of conditions that allow for the National Socialist Party, they become known to Americans as Nazis, they are going to start to rise up and seize power in these conditions. So, when we look at the origins of the Nazi Party, it was founded in 1919 as the German Workers' Party. It was really quickly renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In German, it breaks down to like National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty. So it's National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty. Don't worry, you don't need to know that for the exam. But it's because of that Z in the German spelling of socialism that we come to call them Nazis. National Socialists is essentially, and that was really the popular nickname for them back in the 30s, is when people were watching what they were doing in Germany, they tended to call them the National Socialist Party. Nazi leaders are going to really gain their foothold first in the Bavarian regions, which is like southern Germany, it's the mountains in southern Germany, right on the borders of Austria. Particularly around Munich in Bavaria is where they start to get their rise. And what they do is they start by going into beer halls. If you're not familiar with German culture, even up until today, they have big beer halls, although I imagine things have changed a lot more recently. But you go and there's big long tables and big tables set up for everybody, and everybody gets their beer served in the big beer steins. But this is where social interaction happens in Bavarian society, as people meet in the beer halls and they talk. And what the Nazis do is they go into the beer halls and they start talking about how horrible Germany is right now, about how the Weimar government is screwing everything up, about how they never should have surrendered in World War I. They never should have signed into the Treaty of Versailles. And as I'm sure most of you are familiar, they're also talking about how so many of their economic and their social and their political problems are the direct result and can be blamed on Jewish people living in their territories. That's what the Nazi Party is doing. They go and think about it. It's a brilliant political tactic. You have a bunch of already angry people because they're desperate, they're hurting. And then they're in there drinking beer all night. It's way easier to rile up a drunk person than it is a sober person. And that's what the Nazis are all about. They go into these beer halls, find a bunch of drunken, angry young Germans, and they piss them off. And they say, you want to know why you should be pissed off? Because of what your government's doing to you. It's the Weimar Republic as they are destroying Germany. And that's how they're going to do this. And then ultimately, this spills over. In 1923, Adolf Hitler and the other Nazi leaders organized something known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And what that means is they actually pour out of the beer halls in Munich where they were allowed to operate and speak and get people all riled up. And they actually, as a paramilitary group, go out and start demonstrating in the streets. Now, the Nazi Party holds a far-right political stance. They argue for the removal. This is what they're ideologically all about. They're arguing for the removal of the Weimar Republic. They talk about strengthening the national economy by rejecting the Treaty of Versailles entirely. In other words, saying, we don't owe France or Britain anything. They can get lost. I don't owe them any money, and we're not going to pay it. They say that they need to suppress communism and Bolshevism. They are socialists, so they're not looking to suppress that. But they are looking to suppress communism and what they generally are going to call communists Bolsheviks, because communism is a fairly new idea in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, the final idea, and the one that you're probably most familiar with, is that they're going to push to create a living space for what they call pure blood or Aryan Germans. And I want to tease that idea out a little bit of what it means to be Aryan, because the Nazi idea of what it means to be Aryan is so confusing and convoluted to a historian that it just simply makes no sense. But it shows you. And this is what's really important about and why I always bring this out as part of my lecture on the Nazi Party. Because they take history and they take what could be seen as historical fact and they manipulate it and they bastardize it and they use it for their own ends. And they're going to take this idea of what it means to be Aryan, completely misinterpret what Aryan actually was, and create this new identity of being a pure-blood German that before that never really existed. And so, in addition to all this, obviously they practice and preach a very radical form of anti-Semitism, basically blaming the Jews for almost every problem in post-World War I Germany. And so they're going to be the ones that really, they become the scapegoats. I'm sure you've heard that before, that the Nazis are looking to scapegoat somebody for all these problems, and they're going to blame the Jews. And so it's also important to understand, though, that rhetoric is not as strong in the beginning. In the 1920s, the rhetoric on the extermination of Jewish people is not as fully developed as when we get to the 1930s. That's an idea that sort of gains in momentum amongst Nazis over time. But we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, I want to talk about this idea of Aryan and what this really means. So, Aryan migration is something that I'm not too long ago was teaching about in my ancient world history class, my World History 1 class. Aryans are people who are thought they are a very, very, very old group. They are a group that is thought to have originated in the Caucasus mountain range. And so they're coming out of that theoretical homeland, but they come and settle in Iran. That's where actually Iran gets its name. It's just a formation of Aryan, Iran. You can see the similarity there. But basically, these are ancient people. They migrated into Iran and then from Iran through Mesopotamia, the sort of Fertile Crescent, Iraq down to the south, along the Tigris and the Euphrates. They end up as far south as India. They go down and they're responsible for contributing to the sort of demographic makeup and the linguistic makeup of northern India. But we're talking about this is all happening back in to give you some sort of time period on it, these migrations are happening in like 3000 BC. And so they're moving down through Iran, they're moving, but they also are thought to have moved and sort of spread into Europe as well. Now, let me tell you what this means. In reality, what this means is that this is the root of Indo-European languages. In other words, you can look at some of the base words in a language like Farsi, and you can look at the base words in a language like French, and you're going to find some similar roots there because they are part of this larger Indo-European family. The Aryans are the ones responsible for spreading that linguistic family. But what the Germans do is they say, these are the original Caucasians. They're the original white people. They're original Europeans. They came from the Caucasus mountain range. And so what the Germans do is they re-envision this race, the Aryan race, as being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, basically Nordic, Scandinavian, Germanic-looking people. And so they would take these groups and say, this is what they were. And what happened was as the Aryans moved to India and they spread their language to India, they were overcome by these horrible dark-skinned barbarians that were already living there. And so they were kind of driven out of existence there. And the same thing happened in Iran. And the same thing happened in Asia. And it happened in the Near East. And it happened in North Africa and everywhere else that the Indo-Europeans went. And the only place that their perfect society, their tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed, Indo-European speaking Aryan race, this invented race that the Germans imagined, the only place that they actually didn't get overrun by barbarians and basically uncivilized masses was in Germany and in that area of Europe. And so that's how they reinvent this idea. And that's why they use the swastika as their symbol. They're pulling this idea directly out from basically Sanskrit, which is the language, it's the written script in which Indo-Aryan languages were sort of expressed. But that's in the Indus River Valley in like Pakistan and India. And it has no connection at all to Germanic peoples. It has no connection at all to Caucasian people or European people. It's a reinvention. In fact, if you look back at it, the Aryan group looked very, very similar to everybody else back then, which is they were probably mixed race, mixed ethnicity. But more likely than not, they were darker skin, darker hair, darker complexion, darker eyes. And so they didn't look anything like this Nazi poster boy that the Nazis are calling Aryan. And this just shows you how dangerous history can be. If you don't really understand what's going on, somebody like Hitler and somebody like the Nazis can come along and manipulate it and convince you of something that has no basis in historical reality. And that's exactly what they did with this sort of Aryan imagery, the Aryan identity. And so that's all part of that idea of sort of creating this homeland for the Aryan Germanic people. So Adolf Hitler is going to, very early on in the Nazi Party's emergence, become very, very prominent within this new party. Hitler is Austrian by nationality. He's not German, but he's a veteran of World War One. And he, like many people in Germany, is absolutely furious about the conditions under which Germany surrendered. So he is, because he's very bombastic, very, very charismatic, very, I mean, if you've ever seen him speak, he's like, he's pounding on the podium and screaming. It gets people riled up. He's generally good at making people angry, which is what his goal is. And so he comes up really fast in 1920 to 1922 in the Nazi Party. He's arrested in that beer hall push in 1923 by the Weimar government. So when he's in jail for 9 months for what he did in the beer hall push, he pens his famous manifesto, which is known as Mein Kampf, or Mein Purpose, My Purpose. It lays out his goals and his plans for the political future of Germany and German people. But it also talks about a racial cleansing of the German lands. The book is published in 1925, and it becomes a bestseller all over Europe. It's translated into French, it's translated into Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and English and Dutch, and people are reading this all over the place. It's very, very popular in Russia, as a matter of fact. And that shows you how popular anti-Semitism is not specific to Germany. It is a big problem all over Central, Western, and Eastern Europe at this point in time. So Hitler is going to, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, rise up to become the face of the Nazi Party. He is their new leader. In 1932, the Nazis run as one of the political parties, and they basically become the head of a coalition government. Hitler will win a democratic election in 1932 to be placed in charge of a government that included Nazis, but also other political parties. And so it's important to understand, you often hear people talking about the fact that the Nazis were democratically elected, and that is 100% true with Adolf Hitler. But between 1932 and 1938, Hitler and the Nazis go on a anti-Nazi purge. In other words, if you are a non-Nazi politician, you disappear overnight. If you're an anti-Nazi intellectual, you better get on your high horse and get out of Germany, because you also will find yourself gone. And so they effectively are just going to remove any political opposition in Germany so that the national government is entirely run by Nazis. In 1938, they have effectively killed any sort of coalition government. There's nothing but Nazis in charge of the German government by that point. And so they start to reform their ruling government into what they call the Third Reich, or the Third Reign. It's symbolic. It means a lot to the German people, because what Hitler and the Nazis actually say is there have only ever been three legitimate German governments. The first one was the Holy Roman Empire. So way, way back, going back to like the time of Charlemagne. The second is the Imperial Germany, the one that existed in the 1800s and engaged in overseas colonialism. The one that was basically broken apart and disbanded in World War I. And then the Third Reich, the third legitimate German government, is the Nazi Party, the one that's speaking for true, pure-blood Germans. That's how they talk about it. So they are going to, on March 12th, 1938, Germany is going to march its armies into the neighboring country of Austria, and they will annex the country, making it part of their newly developed Third Reich. And so you'll often hear people also say about Hitler that the first country that he invaded was his own, and that is entirely true. He uses the armies of Germany to invade Austria. Now, the Nazi Party calls this event the annexation or the connection. In German, it's known as the Anschluss. The Anschluss is the language and the word they use here is important. I have to point this out, because this is how they're going to get away with doing something like this. To march into another country and take over is expressly forbidden. Germany is not allowed to do that under the Treaty of Versailles. Obviously, the Nazis don't care too much about the tenets of the Treaty of Versailles. They're willing to break them. But what Hitler is going to do here, he does some sort of semantic rhetoric here. He goes, I'm not invading anybody. They wanted us to come and take over because they're Germans. What I'm doing is connecting German people together. I'm creating a Germany for all Germanic people. So, no, I'm not invading. No, I'm not conquering. No, I'm not taking over. I'm connecting. I'm annexing. I'm bringing everybody together. They're Germans down in Austria. That's what he says. They're Germans. They just aren't part of the German government. And so I'm going to annex Austria and make it part of the Third Reich. All I'm doing is getting all the German people back together under one government. No big deal, right? And that's how he's going to escape sort of punishment for this. He's not allowed to go out and take another independent country, but that's exactly what he does. Now, with this invasion of Austria, we really start to see the beginnings of the Holocaust taking shape. Days after the Anschluss, Germans began their ethnic cleansing of the Third Reich by targeting and rounding up any Austrian Jewish people they could get their hands on. The Jewish stores were looted, Jewish property was seized, and Jews were forced to retreat from public life entirely. In 1935, before this invasion, before this connection, as Hitler calls it, the Nazis had passed extremely anti-Semitic laws known as the Nuremberg Laws. These laws severely restricted the rights and movements of Jewish people and other groups, not just Jewish people, under Nazi rule. First, the laws strip German Jewish people of citizenship outright. You're not even protected by Germany anymore. You're not a citizen of Germany. They say you cannot be Jewish and German. The laws forbade intermarriage between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans. And so this was a problem because there was a lot of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews in Germany up till that point. So later in the same year, 1935, the Nazis expanded the Nuremberg laws to include black Germans or Germans of African descent. And then really they also targeted what they called gypsies or the Romani people. They label all of these groups alongside the Jews as enemies of the state. That's the language that they use. And so naturally, again, you do have to pay attention to this kind of rhetoric. Because what you say by calling somebody an enemy of the state, you're giving your populace free rein to treat them like garbage. You're taking away their protection. You're saying they don't belong here. They're trying to undermine our society. You're basically giving a free pass to everybody in Germany to rise up and attack these people. And then the Nazis later on are going to continue defining and developing the Nuremberg laws. They refine them down to where they start describing who's German and who's a pure blood German and who's not German and who has any kind of Jewish blood in their past. And so these are the things that they start to do under the Nuremberg laws. By November of 1938, 6,000 Jewish people have been rounded up in and around Vienna and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. This is the Nazis are referring to this forced deportation as what they call the Kristallnacht, or the Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass, as it's often called. And so they carry out this raid overnight. It's just one night where they go and round up all the Jewish people, and they force them to go to the Dachau concentration camp. From 1941 onwards, Jews in the city of Vienna are forced, and pretty much all over the Third Reich, are going to be forced to wear the yellow Star of David in a patch on their arms so that they can be publicly identified as Jewish. By the end of 1941, just in Vienna alone, 130,000 Jewish people had fled. 30,000 of them make their way into the United States. And I am wrapping up my lecture here soon, but I do want to tease out this idea because I remember learning about the Holocaust back in high school and in college and stuff. And the question that I always came up with, or at least I always had when this lesson was being taught, was why didn't the United States step in and do something in 1938? Why didn't they step in when this horrible anti-Semitic oppression of the Jewish people was going on? And I always got the same response, which was, well, we didn't really know what was happening back that early on. We didn't know that it was happening. The more research you do, you find out that's just a high school teacher's excuse for they don't know. They don't know why that we didn't do anything. And the reality is we knew very, very, very well. You could look at newspapers all over the United States talking about what the Jewish populations of Europe are experiencing now under Nazi rule. They're talking about what's happening in Austria. How do you get 30,000 migrants from one city in Central Europe alone and not understand why you had this massive influx of migrants, not listen to what they said when they showed up and say, we're literally being sent into forced concentration camps. We're being forced into labor camps over there. They're stealing our property. They're burning our synagogues down. They're forcing us to identify in public so that they can treat us poorly and attack us. And so these are all things that they're newspapers in America. You can go pull out the Philadelphia Inquirer. You can go pull out the Washington Post. You can go pull out the Detroit Free Press or the New York Times. They are showing pictures of the synagogues burning. They're talking about the oppression that the Jewish people are facing. So the idea that the United States and our population at large didn't know about the beginnings of what was happening in Germany, it's a load. It's a load of BS. It's not true at all. The people were acutely aware. The fact of the matter is, they didn't care enough to get too involved. It didn't seem to be an American problem. As long as we allow people to come on over and escape it, then I guess, hey, we're doing our part. But it's not our problem to go and stop anti-Semitism in Central Europe. And it shows you the mindset of the American government at that time. It's not worth the trouble. It's not worth the headache. It's not worth the money. And frankly, it's just not on our top list of priorities. And so, that notion that Americans didn't know about the origins of the Holocaust, that's something that I'm telling you, the evidence roundly rejects it. There's newspaper articles all throughout the 1930s, from 35 to 38, talking about this stuff, talking about what's happening under the Third Reich, the anti-Semitic laws. By 38, what's happening with the Kristallnacht and the Anschluss, and what's happening in Vienna. And we have the people living here in our society to tell us exactly what's going on. So I will talk more about the Holocaust in the context of World War II, but we're going to wrap it up there for this week. So, as usual, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to shoot me an email. Take care.